Here's a question that should be pretty simple, but turns out to not be. What happens when an organization achieves its goal? It should have an obvious answer. The charity that, say, eliminates the disease it was founded to fight. The task force completes its mission. Job done, everyone goes home, right? But if you actually look at what happens in reality, organizations almost never dissolve upon achieving their stated purpose. Instead, they find new purposes, expand their scope, discover the problem was more complex than initially thought. The pattern is so consistent that it practically begs for an explanation. Systems theory offers quite a good one. There's this principle, articulated by Stafford Beer, that the purpose of a system is what it does, not what it claims to do or what it was designed to do, but what it actually does do. Now, this is properly radical because it asks us to ignore everything an organization says about itself and simply watch its behavior. If a system consistently produces outcome X while claiming to pursue outcome Y, then X is its real purpose. When you apply this lens anywhere, to corporations, government agencies, nonprofits, something uncomfortable emerges. Almost every organization, given enough time, begins optimizing for its own survival rather than its stated mission. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that every organization is corrupt or is failing morally, but it's simply the natural evolution of systems. And once you understand it, you start to see it everywhere. Every system faces the same existential threat. Success might actually kill it. Consider a charity founded to eradicate a disease. It raises money, builds infrastructure, hires brilliant people, and develops genuine expertise. And eventually, the disease actually does disappear if the organization is successful. By this point, the organization has already evolved beyond its original purpose, though. It has employees who have to pay mortgages, leadership with careers built around the work, donors whose very identity is tied to the cause. All of this creates enormous pressure for the organization or the charity to persist beyond the original goal. So, the organization adapts. Perhaps the disease isn't fully eradicated. There are still edge cases, at-risk populations, and potential resurgence. And perhaps there are related diseases that could benefit from the same approach. Each justification might be entirely legitimate, but notice what they all accomplish. They ensure that the organization continues. And this is the iron law of institutions. Organizations optimize for their own continuation, not the mission. It's not that people are deliberately selfish, because most are genuinely dedicated to the stated purpose. But the organization itself has survival instincts that operate independently of anyone's intentions. Systems that prioritize mission completion tend to die out fast, but systems that prioritize self-preservation tend to survive. And over time, through pure selection pressure, we end up with a world stuffed full of organizations exquisitely designed to perpetuate themselves. It's essentially like natural selection, but for businesses. And once you start looking for it, you see the machinery everywhere. Systems develop sophisticated methods to ensure they survive, and they all work toward the same end: making the organization itself indispensable. They expand their scope gradually into adjacent territories. What starts as consumer protection could become financial regulation, and then data privacy and digital platforms. Each step seems reasonable enough, but collectively, the organization becomes impossible to complete or compete against. They generate complexity, turning simple problems into hundreds of pages of regulations that require experts to simply navigate the structure of it. And the more complex it becomes, the more necessary the organization seems. They shift from solving problems to simply managing them. Organizations rarely claim that they will ever solve issues anymore, but simply address or work on them perpetually. They measure what makes them look successful rather than what indicates mission achievement. They rely on test scores instead of actually evaluating a student's ability to learn and how many times a patient comes back to the doctor instead of their actual health outcomes. And most cleverly, they create entire ecosystems of stakeholders who benefit from their very existence. A government agency spawns compliance industries. A charity develops donors whose purpose is tied to the cause. And a regulatory body creates law firms specializing in its regulations. So soon, it's not necessarily that you're fighting one organization, but everyone who has built their life around it. And none of this necessarily requires conspiracy theories to prove, because it emerges naturally from rational individual choices. A program officer frames declining numbers as progress requiring investment, rather than mission approaching completion. They're protecting jobs and work that they might believe in. A board member advocates expanding because our expertise is valuable elsewhere. So, why waste build-up capacity? A fundraiser emphasizes ongoing challenges because donors respond to urgent needs, not necessarily completed victories. Each decision is defensible, but collectively, the organization drifts from its original purpose towards a new one, its own continuation. If we have ever stopped to ask why nothing gets done, really about anything, this is the reason. Reform is so frustratingly difficult in today's world. Replace every person and the same patterns emerge because they're structural, not personal or even political. And the most perverse effect is that actual mission success becomes a threat to manage rather than the goal to pursue. Imagine working for an organization who is dedicated to reducing homelessness. Through genuine effort, homelessness actually drops dramatically. So, your efforts, your time, and the money that they've invested into the organization is actually paying off. But once the homelessness problem is solved or reduced to very, very low numbers, do you still have a job? Does your department even get funded? The people most capable of solving the problem have the most to lose from actually solving it. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is going to sabotage solutions, but they'll unconsciously gravitate towards interpretations that keep the problem urgent. The homeless population dropped by 80%? Well, the remaining 20% are the hardest to serve, requiring sustained intervention. So the problem hasn't been solved. It's entered a new and more complex phase requiring the same organizational structure. Because notice how rare it is for an organization to come out and say, "We've accomplished our goal. Others can take it from here and we're dissolving our mission." Yeah, it doesn't happen. Now, this problem exists in small organizations, but becomes nearly inevitable at scale. The larger the ecosystem, the more momentum it has, and the more people depend on it. So it's harder to change or dissolve the organization. Take universities, for example. Most universities were funded and founded to educate and advance knowledge. But modern research universities primarily focus on endowment growth, prestige rankings, and constantly expanding their campus and facilities. Sure, education happens, but the resources are actually going towards many, many other things. The institution's continuation takes precedence over educational outcomes. And at sufficient scale, the social cost of dissolution becomes so high that continuation seems like the only reasonable choice, regardless of whether the original mission justifies it or not. And government might be the purest expression of self-perpetuating systems because it combines every amplifying factor imaginable. It essentially has monopoly power. There is one IRS and one regulatory framework. Without competition, there's no pressure punishing inefficiency. It can't fail in the traditional sense because agencies can become obsolete or counterproductive and continue indefinitely with guaranteed funding through taxation. It has theoretically an infinite scope. Any problem can justify new programs or interventions, and its complexity serves as a shield. The tax code and regulatory frameworks are so impenetrable that you can't reform what you can't understand. And the result is the pattern that we've discussed, only amplified. Programs meant to be temporary become permanent. Agencies expand beyond their original mandates, and success is measured by activity rather than outcomes. And government shutdowns reveal this beautifully. They look like system failure. The government can't even fund itself. But watch what actually happens. The mechanisms of power continue to run. Congressional offices stay open. The machinery that caused the shutdown never actually stops. Parks might close and scientists might not be able to work. But the apparatus for arguing about these things operates perfectly. And then the crisis generates political capital, media attention, and fundraising. All of the energy that could go towards structural reform gets consumed by immediate drama. And when it reopens, inevitably, everyone is relieved that government works again, without asking whether the system actually needs a redesign. The shutdown is just the system sustaining itself through crisis and the appearance of vital importance. So, if systems naturally evolve towards self-perpetuation, what does that mean for solving problems? Should we build organizations with expiration dates, accept that drift is inevitable and create correction mechanisms, embrace temporary structures? Or is fighting this pattern fighting human nature itself? Because maybe perpetuation is the price of stability. The default is perpetuation, and fighting it requires deliberate, ongoing effort. At the end of the day, the purpose of a system is what it does. Not what it says, not what someone intended, but what it actually does. And what most systems eventually do is sustain themselves. And if that means that the problem that they're trying to solve never actually gets solved, so be it. And if it means that we continue to accept inefficiencies over actual solutions, then for the system and for the organizations, that's okay. But for our morality and for people's well being, maybe it's time to actually look at proper solutions. So, with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I will see y'all next time.